All right, and section 7.5 is going to be about factoring the following polynomials. Anything that looks like x squared plus bx plus c. And so when you are factoring, there's going to be some standards that we're going to set forth today. And writing a polynomial as a product of factors is called factoring. And to factor something that looks like x squared plus bx plus c, so any, you know, trinomial that is written in pretty standard form, you'll factor it into something that's like x plus p multiplied by x plus q. And to do that, you need to find a p and q that satisfy the following. B is equal to P plus Q. So this B right here is this B, and P and Q, you know, are right here. And you also have to satisfy that C is equal to P multiplied by Q. And this is coming from FOIL, which we learned a couple of times ago. And so P and Q, C and C. And so if we were to take x plus a p, multiply that by x plus a q, that is going to be equal to, well, if we use FOIL, our first terms will be x multiplied by x, or x squared, plus, we'll go to our outside terms, which is going to be x multiplied by q, plus, we'll go to our inside terms, p multiplied by x, or x multiplied by p, plus our last terms, which will be p and q, so p multiplied by q. And so this would be written as an x squared plus an x. This q and p we can add together inside the parentheses here, plus p multiplied by q. And when we write this as x squared plus bx plus c, this is where we get those numbers from. So this b is this b, which is this b. And this c is this c, which is that c right there. And so I know this is probably a bit confusing when you're just looking at this with letters. So some examples of that would be something like the following. If we took an x squared plus a 6x plus a 5, sorry if you hear my cat meowing, that is going to be equal to an x plus 5 multiplied by an x plus 1. Likewise, an x squared minus 6x plus 5 is going to be equal to an x minus 5 multiplied an x minus 1. And I know we didn't actually do anything yet, but this is just going to be our groundwork, right? And so we're going to do some different examples, all right? We're going to see what happens when our b is positive, when our B is negative, and what happens when our C is negative as well. So we'll do that all in due time. So first today, why don't we get started with what happens when we factor something when both our B and our C are positive numbers. So let's try to factor the following. X squared plus 10x plus 16. And the first thing I want to do is I want you to notice what our B and our C are equal to. B is going to be equal to the number in front of x, or 10. And C is going to be equal to the number on the end, or 16. All right, so C is 16 and B is 10. And here's what we know. Because C is equal to 16, and we know that C is equal to multiplying two numbers together, and 16 is positive, then our factors will have the same sign. So they'll both either be positive or they'll both either be negative. And because B is equal to 10, and that is also positive, then you know our P plus a Q has to equal a positive number. And so now all you have to do, since C is going to be equal to two numbers multiplied together, right? Because C is equal to P multiplied by Q, and B is equal to a P plus a Q, all we're going to do is start with this number C and list the factors of 16. And so one factor of 16 would be 1 multiplied by 16. Another factor of 16 would be a 2 multiplied by an 8. And then finally a 4 multiplied by a 4. All right, so these are our possible C's. And over here we can sum them together, and these will be our possible B's. Because C and B are comprised of the same number, we now need to identify what happens when we add these together. So 1 plus 16, 1 plus 16 added together is going to be a 17. 2 plus an 8 added together is a 10. And a 4 plus a 4 is an 8. So now we need to find the two sets of numbers that satisfy this B and C. And because our B needs to equal, or sorry, our C needs to equal 16, right? So all of these fall under the category of 16. We need to find the sum that is 10. And so the only one that has a sum of 10 is the factors of 2 and 8. So now all you will write is that x squared plus 10x plus 16 is equal to x plus 2 multiplied by x plus 8. And why don't we do ahead and do some extra practice with that, because that was a lot of explanation. I want to show you really how straightforward this is. So our first extra practice problem is going to be an x squared plus a 7x plus a 6. And all you need to do is identify your B and C. So B is going to be equal to 7. C is going to be equal to 6. And you want to multiply to get C. And you want to add to get 7. So why don't we look right here at the factors of 6. So you can multiply 1 and 6 together to get 6, or you can multiply 2 and 3 together to get 6. right? As soon as you go to 3, then you're multiplying by 2, and 6 and 1. So those don't matter. And now, why don't we see what sum to 7? All right, well, 1 plus 6 is equal to a 7, and a 2 plus a 3 is equal to a 5. So the numbers we want are 1 and 6, so x squared plus 7x plus a 6 is equal to an x plus 1 multiplied by an x plus a 6. If we want to do another one here and factor something like an x squared plus a 9x plus an 8, right? Our b is going to be equal to 9 and our c is going to be equal to 8. We're going to want to multiply to get our c, so let's list our factors of 8. You can multiply 1 and 8 to get 8, 2 and 4 to get 8, and well, that's about it. And then let's see what sums to 9. So 1 plus 8 is equal to 9, 2 plus 4 is equal to 6, so the numbers we want are the 1 and the 8. So an x squared plus a 9x plus an 8 is equal to an x plus 1 multiplied by an x plus 8. So now let's see what happens when we have some negative numbers in the mix. So what happens when we factor and b is negative and c is positive. All right, so let's try to factor something like an x squared minus an 8x plus a 12. All right, and that big key right here is that there's that negative sign right there. So scrolling back up here, if you see a positive sign in front of your b, then you're going to be working with all positive numbers. If you see a negative sign in front of your b, things are going to be a little bit different. So our b is equal to a negative 8, and our c is equal to a 12. And remember, b is equal to p plus q, and c is equal to p multiplied by q. And so since c equals 12 is positive, once again, when you multiply two numbers together and they have to be positive, you know p multiplied by a q is the same sign. So they're either both positive or they're both negative. Since b equals a negative 8 is negative, and you're adding two numbers together, you know that p plus q both have to be negative. So the only difference that we're going to do now is when we list our factors, we're going to list out the negative factors. And so if we want to list out the factors of 12, we can have a negative 1 multiplied by a negative 12, a negative 2 multiplied by a negative 6, a negative 3 multiplied by a negative 4, and that's about it. And now we can see which one of those sum to a negative 8. So negative 1 plus a negative 12 is negative 13. Negative 2 multiplied by, negative 2 plus a negative 6 is a negative 8. And negative 3 plus a negative 4 is a negative 7. So the factors we want are this negative 2 and this negative 6. So x squared minus an 8x plus a 12 is equal to x minus 2 multiplied by x minus 6. All right, and why don't we do another example of that real quick? So let's go ahead and factor something like w squared minus 4w plus 3. All right, you're going to identify this negative right here, so you're going to be working with all negative numbers. All right, and so our b is equal to a negative 4, and our c is equal to a positive 3. So we're going to list factors of positive 3, but since we're working with this negative, we want to list the negative factors. And so that's going to be a negative 1 and a negative 3. That's it. And so you know that those have to sum to a negative 4, because negative 1 plus a negative 3 is a negative 4. So this one's rather straightforward. We're going to say that w squared minus 4w plus a 3 is equal to a w minus 1 multiplied by a w minus 3. So what I want you to notice on all of these problems so far is that our c has been positive, right? C is a positive 3 here. C is a positive 12 there. C is a positive 8. C is a positive 6, right? C is a positive 16. When that is the case, your factors are going to have the same sign, right? Negative and negative, negative and negative, and then positive and positive. But what happens if C is negative? So let's look at factoring when C is negative. So if C is negative, when you multiply P times the Q equals a negative number, that means one of the signs have to be positive and one has to be negative. So they're going to be opposite signs. And so if we wanted to factor something that looked like an x squared plus 4x minus 21, right? If you identify this as a negative, right? It does not matter what the 4 is here. As long as you have a negative in front of your c, you're going to have opposite signs. So our b is equal to a 4. Our c is equal to a negative 21. And remember, we have to multiply to get that negative 21. So we need a list of factors of negative 21. And we'll see what sums to 4. Well, a negative 1 multiplied by 21 is equal to a negative 21, but a positive 1 multiplied by a negative 21 is also equal to negative 21. Then we could have a negative 3, and you can multiply that by a negative 7. Oh, no, you can't. You can multiply that by a positive 7 to get a negative 21. Or you could take a positive 3 and multiply that by a negative 7 to get a negative 21 as well. This first one is going to be 21 added together, then negative 21. Negative 3 plus a 7 is a positive 4, and 3 minus 7 is a negative 4. So now we want a b that is equal to 4, so we're going to be right there. And so x squared plus 4x minus 21 is going to be equal to x minus 3 times x plus 7, right? Whatever sign is with these, because that's technically a plus, is going to go here and here. All right, so why don't we do tons of practice problems? If you feel confident on this, you're free to go, right? That's all I have, but why don't we do tons of practice problems? We're going to start with number 2. We technically already did one in an earlier example. So number 2 is going to be x squared minus 14x plus 24. And I'm going to write number 3 here so you can start thinking about it. 3 is going to be a y squared plus 13y minus a 30. And so if you look at your b and c, b on this first one is a negative 14, c is equal to a positive 24. If b is negative, right, and c is positive, that means you're going to have same side negatives, right? Both are going to be negative, negative. All right, so if you list your factors of 24 and your sum of negative 14, right, you want to work with some negative numbers. So you could have a negative 1 and a negative 24, a negative 2 and a negative 12, a negative 3 and a negative 8. There's a lot in this one. Negative 4 and a negative 6, and that's about it. Here you're going to have a negative 25, a negative 14, negative 11, and negative 10, 2, 12, 14, that's what we want. So x squared minus 14x plus 24 is going to factor down to x minus 2 multiplied by x minus 12. Here we're going to identify that b is equal to a positive 13 and c is equal to a negative 30. And so if c is a negative number, we need to go ahead and make our signs opposite. So b is going to be equal to 13. Oh, we already wrote that down, didn't we? So since c is a negative number, we need to have opposite signs. So we're going to have a plus and a minus. So we have to list all the different factors of a negative 30. And we're going to see what sum to 13. And so the factors of a negative 30 can be a negative 1 and a positive 30. A positive 1 and a negative 30. A negative 2 and a positive 15. Or positive 2 and a negative 15. There's quite a bit here. Negative 3 and a positive 10. And a positive 3 and a negative 10. All right, there's more, but I'm going to tell you we're there, right? There's also 5 and 6. But if we add these together, that's going to be a 29. It's going to be a negative 29. There's going to be a positive 13. That's going to be a negative 13. There's going to be a positive 7. That's going to be a negative 7. And so we want to hit a goal of 13. Well, that is going to be right there. And so y squared plus 13y minus 30 is going to equal y minus 2 multiplied by y plus 15.